The morning started as usual. I woke up before anyone else. A habit I'd picked up in the couple years I'd been married to John. He's the kind of man who's always in a hurry, even when there's plenty of time. The house was quiet. Michael, my 17-year-old stepson, was still asleep. I turned on the coffee maker and started making breakfast: scrambled eggs and bacon, toast, and fresh orange juice. John appeared in the kitchen about 15 minutes later, still in his pajama pants, but with his laptop under his arm. "You're my hero," he murmured, sniffing the air and smiling. "It smells amazing." "And you're not dressed yet." I nodded at my watch. "Aren't you going to be late?" He just waved and grabbed a mug of coffee. John was easy. He was my island of stability after a turbulent youth, and frankly, I loved him for it. Michael showed up in the kitchen just as John was about to leave. Sleepy, disheveled, headphones in his ears. He didn't even look at me as he poured himself some cereal and milk, and then he mumbled something to himself and went back to his room. "Do you know what to do with him?" John asked, putting his coat on by the door. "He's a teenager," I shrugged. "Teenagers are like that, aren't they? Just go easy on him. It's not easy for him." John left, leaving me alone with Michael. I put in my headphones, put on a playlist of energetic songs, and started cleaning. Michael rarely spoke to me. From the beginning, he clearly wasn't thrilled that his father had remarried. I tried to stay out of his way, even though it hurt sometimes. It was like he only saw me as an outsider. When I finished cleaning, the house was quiet again. Just me, the kitchen, and the music playing in the background. But this morning only seemed ordinary. I decided to occupy myself with baking. It always calmed me down, even when things were a mess at home. Rummaging through the shelves in the kitchen, I found a recipe for an old apple pie that had always failed in my youth. Why not try it again? I laid out the ingredients: flour, sugar, cinnamon, eggs. Everything was going smoothly until I found the whisk stuck in the drawer under the sink. Crap. I bent over trying to pull it out with one hand, the other holding a cup of sugar for some reason. Naturally, the sugar ended up on the floor and I ended up on all fours. At that moment, I felt someone's presence. I turned around and there was Michael standing right in the doorway. "What are you doing?" His voice was a chuckle and embarrassment at the same time. "I'm playing kitchen acrobat," I replied, standing up and tucking in my robe, which opened when I reached for the whisk. "Sorry about the view." He looked at me like he didn't know how to react. I must have looked weird, because I wasn't wearing anything under the robe. "Did you need something?" I asked, trying to pretend that nothing unusual was going on. "I was just thirsty," he mumbled, and went to the refrigerator. Michael poured himself some water and stood there instead of leaving. I felt a little awkward. "Do you like apple pie?" I asked, trying to fill the pause. "Dad said you were a good cook." That was unexpected. I was used to his one-word answers, but this was a whole sentence. "Thank you." I smiled. "So you'll stay to try it when it's ready?" "Maybe." He still hadn't left. He stood leaning against the table, watching me knead the dough. I tried to relax, but his eyes were drilling into me. "You know, I don't think you're what everyone says you are," he said suddenly. "Who says what? That you're trying to be liked? That you're trying to replace Mom?" The words caught me off guard. I stopped, clutching the bowl of dough. "I'm not trying to be your mom, Michael," I said calmly. "I just want you to be comfortable." He didn't say anything back. Just shrugged, left the empty glass on the table and went off to his room. I exhaled. This short conversation was the most personal thing that had ever happened between us. But something in his tone made me wonder. The pie went into the oven, and I finally sat down with a cup of coffee. The whole scene with Michael hadn't gotten out of my head. His words stuck somewhere between logic and intuition. He's just a teenager, I reminded myself. He's got a bunch of emotions he doesn't know what to do with. I was starting to get distracted when I heard his footsteps again. Michael appeared in the doorway, pulling the hoodie over his head. He didn't look annoyed this time, but rather puzzled. "Smells good," he said, nodding at the oven. "Uh-huh, we'll be able to try it in half an hour." He sat down slowly at the table, as if watching me. He usually ate on the run or sat in his room. I could tell he wanted to say something important, but he hesitated. Was something wrong? I asked, trying not to startle him. Why did you agree to marry my father in the first place? He suddenly asked, looking straight at me. That question threw me off a little. Because he's a good man, caring, kind, and also, he loves me. Do you love him? I almost laughed at that direct question. Of course, Michael. I wouldn't have married him for nothing. Sometimes it just seems like you're here because you're comfortable. I froze. His gaze was too serious for a 17-year-old. That's not true, I said softly. It's hard for me too, especially with you. With me? He snorted, but there was more sadness in his voice than sarcasm. Yeah, I'm not always like that, am I? No, it's not that. It's just, you're distant, and I'm having a hard time figuring out how to approach you. Michael was silent for a long time, staring at his desk. I don't know what to do with you, he said quietly. I put my hand on the table, a little closer to him, but not touching. Well, you give it a try. We can just start with normal conversations. He nodded, but immediately added, You know, you're beautiful. The second of pause turned into an eternity. Thank you, I replied, trying not to let my voice waver. But let's save the compliments for girls your age. Michael lowered his eyes, blushing. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. It's okay. We were both embarrassed, and tension hung in the air. I decided to change the subject and got up to check on the pie. 10 more minutes, I said, trying to look casual. Michael mumbled something like, okay, and walked out. When he was gone, I finally exhaled. This conversation had been a revelation to me. He may have been looking for support, but his manner of speaking sometimes veered into strange territory. I realized I'd have to be even more careful from here on out. It started as usual. I was back in the kitchen, cleaning up another mess in the drawer under the sink. Spoons, jar lids, and the little things I never threw away always fell there. This time I dropped a tablespoon, and it rolled far behind the pipe. Sighing, I knelt down and bent down to retrieve it. I held the cupboard door with one hand and fumbled in the depths with the other. And just then, Michael walked into the kitchen. Oh, he unbuttoned his pants. I felt hot inside me, and I turned around, almost banging my head on the sink. Michael, can you give me a warning when you come in? I blurted out, trying to stay calm, though I felt hot for what he was doing. It was unexpected of him, but it felt good. Can you not get stuck under the sink? He replied with a weird chuckle. Okay, I'm out of here, he said, turning around and pulling on his pants. When he walked out, I breathed a sigh of relief. But standing in the middle of the kitchen, I realized that I was starting to lose control of the situation. Michael was clearly trying to communicate more, but sometimes his behavior was too ambiguous. Something about him was changing, and I didn't know how to react to it. And this time I decided that I wasn't going to ignore what was happening anymore. I had to figure out where the desire to help ended, and where the fine line between stepmother and a teenager who was clearly confused about his feelings began. The next morning began with a slight uneasiness. Michael behaved as usual. He locked himself in his room and hardly showed his face. But there was an empty plate in the kitchen. He must have eaten a piece of last night's pie while I slept. I tried to imagine how to develop our relationship further. After all, I'm not only his father's wife, but I'm also somehow someone who should be a support to him. Toward lunchtime, Michael came downstairs. He looked more chipper than usual and didn't even escape my gaze. Would you like some tea? I asked, to lighten the atmosphere. I could, he answered briefly and sat down at the table. I poured him a cup and put it in front of him and sat down across from him. I was thinking maybe you should try talking to your father more. Why? Because you're so angry with him. It's obvious without even saying it. Michael looked up. There was a flicker of surprise in them, but he quickly hid it behind his usual indifference. He thinks he knows what's best for me, he said. But he never asks me what I want. Then tell him. Talk to him. He snorted. That's easy to say. You can see he's always busy. I sighed. You wouldn't believe it, but he does care about you. He's just not very good at it. Michael hesitated, swirling his mug. Do you feel sorry for me too? No, I said firmly. I respect you, and I want you to know that I care. He was silent, and we both sat in that strange but almost cozy silence. At one point, he suddenly said, "You're strange. You're not like the others. Is that a bad thing?" I smiled, trying to hide the awkwardness. I don't know. He stood up. Just, thanks for the tea. I followed his gaze as he walked away. That brief dialogue made me think. Michael was clearly reaching out to me, and yet his words often went beyond what I expected. He was looking for a connection, but perhaps he himself didn't know what kind. The next day, I suggested that John talk to Michael. He agreed, but it was obvious he was uncomfortable. Are you sure this is a good idea? He asked. Absolutely. You need to find common ground. I knew Michael needed to have this conversation, but I was realizing more and more each day that I needed to set clear boundaries too. Something in our interaction was starting to get out of whack. John came home from work late, as usual, but when he saw me in the kitchen, he stopped. He looked tired, but he noticed my serious expression. Is something wrong? He asked, undressing and hanging up his coat. We need to talk. I set a cup of coffee in front of him and gestured for him to sit down. John sighed and sat down, looking at me with slight concern. It's about Michael. What is it again? Did he do something wrong? No, it's nothing like that. I just feel like he's getting more and more distant. John frowned. He's a teenager. That's normal. Yeah, but I think he needs more attention. He feels like you barely talk to him. I am talking. John, you're talking the way bosses talk to their employees. You're giving him instructions. That's not communication. He sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. Okay, what are you suggesting? Just talk to him. Ask him how he's doing, what's going on at school, what he's worried about. John didn't say anything. He looked lost, and I felt a little sorry for him. Do you think he hates me? He asked quietly. No, I answered, putting my hand on his shoulder. He just needs to realize that you're listening to him. John nodded, but I could tell by the look on his face that he was doubting whether he was going to make it. You're good at this, you know, he said suddenly, looking at me. With what? With Michael. With our family. It's hard for me to imagine what it's like for you. I smiled, but my insides clenched. John had no idea how his son made me feel sometimes. Thank you. But you have to try harder too. He nodded, and we decided that he and Michael would spend the weekend together. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how confused I was. I couldn't ignore how out of balance I was sometimes by talking to Michael. His words, his looks, they seemed to want to say more than I could afford to hear. I rolled onto my side, watching John sleep next to me. He trusted me, and I couldn't let that trust crumble. But thoughts of Michael still kept me awake. In the morning, I woke up before everyone else, as I always did. The sunlight was streaming through the kitchen curtains, making the house cozy and somehow especially peaceful. Michael came into the kitchen first again, but this time he looked relaxed. Good morning, I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Uh-huh, he mumbled, opening the refrigerator. I noticed that he'd brought a plate from his room, a rare gesture for him. Michael didn't say a word, but the way he carefully placed the plate in the sink felt like the beginning of something new. Dad, had you decided what you were going to do with your father this weekend? I asked to keep the conversation going. He wants to go fishing, Michael snorted. Why would I want to go fishing? It's an opportunity to spend time with him. I tried to keep my voice calm. Michael looked at me, as if trying to see how serious I was being. He thinks fishing will solve everything? And you don't think it's worth a try? He stopped talking, and I realized he was thinking. Okay, he finally said. I'll give it a try. I smiled, satisfied that the conversation hadn't turned into an argument. We both started breakfast, but the atmosphere was strangely casual. For a moment, I felt like there was some sort of truce between us. The pie was delicious last night, Michael said suddenly. Thank you. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he added, You're not as bad as I thought you'd be. I laughed. Well, thank you, Michael. Is that a compliment? I guess so, he said. And for the first time in a long time I saw a slight smile on his face. That moment reminded me that despite all the difficulties, we had a chance to be a family, even if it wasn't perfect. The day passed quietly. John got home from work early and even tried to talk to Michael. They argued a bit about fishing, but eventually Michael agreed. That evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, Michael came in again. Hey, he said, feignedly nonchalant. Hey, do you need something? He hesitated, then asked, Do you really want me to patch things up with him? Yes, it's important for both of you. And for you? I looked at him, trying to figure out what he meant. It's important to me that you're happy, Michael. He held his gaze on me again, and I felt the air in the room grow thick. Okay, he said quietly, and then he turned and walked out. That was the end of it. No more strange conversations, no more hidden undertones. The next day, Michael and John went fishing, and I stayed home, savoring the rare moment of silence. But in the back of my mind, I knew it was still early days. Michael and I had found common ground, but it made our relationship even more complicated. I now realized that sometimes there was a fine line between intimacy and boundary.